The rain hammered against the warehouse windows in Shepperton, a small town west of London that smelled of damp earth and motor oil. Inside, Jasper Maskelyne stood before a wooden skeleton that barely resembled a tank. He ran his hand along the frame, feeling the grain beneath his calloused fingers. Outside this building, the real war raged. Inside, he was building a different kind of arsenal. Maskelyne had magic in his blood. His grandfather performed for Victorian crowds. His father dazzled audiences between the wars. Jasper himself had filled theaters before 1939, making elephants vanish and women float. But when Hitler's bombs started falling on London, illusions on stage seemed pointless. The British Army didn't initially agree. When Maskelyne volunteered, they assigned him to entertaining troops. He wanted to fight. They wanted him to juggle. Everything changed when Colonel Dudley Clark saw him perform in Cairo. Clark ran a special unit, one that didn't fire bullets but spread confusion. He understood that warfare wasn't just about destroying the enemy. It was about making them see things that weren't there, believe things that weren't true. Clark needed someone who understood deception at its core. He needed a magician. Now Maskelyne commanded a team of artists, carpenters, engineers, and set designers. They called themselves the Magic Gang. Their workshop in Shepperton looked like a film studio merged with military depot. Rolls of canvas hung from rafters. Half-built tank shells stood in rows. Paint fumes mixed with cigarette smoke. These weren't toys. They were tactical weapons designed to fool aerial reconnaissance and ground intelligence. The wooden tank frame before Maskelyne would become part of Operation Fortitude, the massive deception plan supporting D-Day. The Allies needed Hitler to believe the invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. They needed him to see armies where empty fields existed. Maskelyne's dummies would create that illusion. Each one needed to look real from the air, cast proper shadows, and withstand basic scrutiny. German reconnaissance planes flew over England constantly, photographing troop movements and equipment. Those photographs reached analysts in Berlin, who counted every tank, every plane, every truck. Maskelyne's job was to give them plenty to count. He walked the planning table where blueprints sprawled across the surface. His second-in-command, Bill Robson, a former theater carpenter from Manchester, was studying the drawings. Robson had built sets for West End productions before the war. Now, he built military fakes. The transition wasn't as strange as it seemed. Both required making audiences believe in something that didn't exist. Robson looked up. "The timber shipment arrives tomorrow. We can start full production by week's end." Maskelyne nodded. "We need 500 tanks completed within 6 weeks. The invasion timeline doesn't wait for carpentry delays. 500 tanks. The number seemed impossible. But Maskelyne's team had already produced thousands of dummy aircraft, artillery pieces, and landing craft for earlier operations. They had learned efficiency. A real tank took months to manufacture and cost a fortune. Maskelyne's version required 4 men, basic lumber, and canvas. They could produce one in hours for less than 100 pounds. The design was brilliant in its simplicity. A wooden frame provided structure. Canvas stretched over it created the shell. Careful painting added details, mud where patterns, track marks. From 500 feet up, a German pilot couldn't tell the difference. Even from ground level, a quick glance suggested authenticity. The dummies couldn't survive close inspection, but they didn't need to. British security kept German agents away from military installations. Maskelyne moved to a completed dummy parked near the warehouse door. It looked like a Sherman tank, complete with turret and gun barrel. He rapped his knuckles against it. The hollow sound echoed. 2 men could lift it. A strong wind might blow it over. But through a camera lens at altitude, it looked like 30 tons of American steel. The other key element was placement. Dummies required proper staging. Real tank units didn't park in perfect rows. They clustered naturally, with maintenance vehicles, fuel trucks, command posts nearby. Maskelyne's team studied actual military deployments, learning how real units organize themselves. They recreated that chaos artificially, adding authenticity through disorder. The morning sun broke through the clouds as Maskelyne arrived at the deployment site in Kent. The field stretched empty except for his team already positioning the first wave of dummies. From where he stood, the wooden tanks looked absurdly fake. Their canvas sides rippled in the breeze. Their proportions seemed slightly off. But Maskelyne wasn't concerned with ground-level appearances. He needed to see them from above. A Royal Air Force liaison officer named Captain Peter Waverly waited by a camouflage jeep. Waverly coordinated reconnaissance flights that would photograph the dummy installations, allowing Maskelyne to verify their effectiveness before German planes arrived. Waverly was a thin man with a precise mustache who treated military protocol like religious doctrine. He checked his watch constantly, as if measuring his life in regulated intervals. "The spotter plane is ready," Waverly announced. "We can begin aerial verification within the hour." Maskelyne walked among the dummies his team had positioned overnight. Each wooden tank sat on wooden planks that simulated track marks in the soft earth. Canvas netting draped over some, mimicking camouflage efforts. Oil drums and equipment crates scattered nearby suggested ongoing operations. Bill Robson supervised the crew adding final touches, painting mud splatter on tank treads, positioning dummy soldiers near supposed command tents. The dummy soldiers were Robson's innovation. Simple wooden frames dressed in uniforms, positioned at angles that suggested activity from the air. They couldn't fool anyone up close, but aerial cameras captured them as human-shaped objects near military equipment. The effect added life to the installation, transforming it from a tank park into an active military base. Maskelyne climbed into the spotter plane, a light reconnaissance aircraft that vibrated with engine noise. The pilot, a young flight officer named Davies, barely looked old enough to drive, but his flying record showed dozens of reconnaissance missions over occupied France. Davies understood what German reconnaissance pilots saw and how they saw it. The plane lifted off, banking over the Kent countryside. Below, the dummy installation spread across 2 fields. From 500 feet, the transformation was remarkable. The wooden tanks became solid, 3-dimensional vehicles. Their shadows fell correctly. Their placement suggested tactical positioning. Canvas ripples disappeared into general texture. The dummy soldiers appeared as personnel, moving between positions. Davies circled lower, dropping to 300 feet. This is the altitude German reconnaissance typically maintains over England. They want detail but not anti-aircraft fire. Even at this height, the deception held. Maskelyne noted areas needing adjustment. One tank cast an incorrect shadow because its angle was wrong. A cluster of 3 tanks looked too uniform, too deliberately placed. He marked these issues on his notepad, mentally calculating corrections. But overall, the installation worked. A German analyst examining photographs would count approximately 40 tanks, support vehicles, and active personnel. They would report a significant armored unit station in Kent, suggesting preparations for a Pas-de-Calais invasion. That false information would travel up the intelligence chain, reinforcing Hitler's belief that the main Allied thrust would come across the narrowest part of the English Channel. Back on the ground, Maskelyne gathered his team. They stood in a loose circle. These artists and carpenters turned military deceivers. Some had worked in theater. Others had been commercial builders. A few were actual soldiers who understood military operations. Together, they created what conventional forces could not produce with conventional weapons. "We need to adjust positions on tanks 7, 12, and 18, Maskelyne explained, referencing his notes. Their shadows are inconsistent with morning sun angles. The German reconnaissance usually flies morning missions, so that's what they'll see." Robson nodded, already mentally calculating the movements required. "What about the southern cluster?" "Add more variation. Make it look Messier. Real units aren't that organized." The team dispersed to make corrections. Maskelyne watched them work, these magicians of war who perform for cameras instead of audiences. Traditional military thinking focused on concentration of force, overwhelming firepower, direct confrontation. But modern warfare had evolved beyond simple physics. Perception mattered as much as reality. If the enemy believed you were strong where you were weak, they would deploy accordingly. If they expected attack from one direction, they would leave another vulnerable. This wasn't new thinking. Deception had always been part of warfare. But never before had it been industrialized like this, produced at scale with dedicated units and resources. Maskline's operation was just one piece of a vast deception network spanning the entire Allied command structure. Fake radio traffic, double agents feeding false information, dummy installations across southern England, inflatable tanks, plywood aircraft, canvas landing craft, all creating the illusion of armies that didn't exist. The Germans were responding exactly as predicted. Intelligence reports showed they were repositioning forces based on the dummy installations. Panzer divisions that might have reinforced Normandy remained near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Every tank Hitler kept near Pas-de-Calais was one less tank facing Allied soldiers on Normandy beaches. Maskline's wooden dummies were saving real lives by attracting attention away from real forces. Captain Waverly approached with new orders. Command wants 3 more installations operational by week's end. They're expanding the deception network across Sussex and Hampshire. 3 more installations meant 1,500 additional dummies. It meant his team working around the clock, his carpenters pushing through exhaustion, his painters working under blackout conditions. But Maskline didn't hesitate. The invasion was coming. Every day a successful deception brought that day closer, while reducing the cost in Allied blood. He looked across the field at his wooden army, his phantom force that existed only in German imaginations. They stood in neat rows now, properly positioned, properly shadowed, properly convincing. From above, they were an armored division. From the ground, they were theater props. The difference between those two perspectives was the difference between victory and defeat. Maskline turned to Robson. "Get the crews ready. We have 3 more sites to build, and less than a week to do it." Robson grinned, that expression of shared understanding between people doing impossible things. Just like opening night in the theater. Except this time, the audience is trying to kill us. Then we better give them a good show. The workshop in Shepperton had become a factory of illusion operating at full capacity. Maskline moved through the organized chaos, observing 3 production lines running simultaneously. The first line produced tank shells. The second fabricated aircraft fuselages. The third constructed artillery pieces. Sawdust filled the air like golden snow. The sound of hammers and saws created a constant percussion that drowned out normal conversation. Men shouted instructions over the noise. Everyone moved with purpose. Maskline had divided his magic gang into specialized teams. The carpenters built frames. The canvas workers stretched and secured fabric. The painters added details and weathering effects. A separate unit handled transportation, moving completed dummies to deployment sites under cover of darkness. Another team managed site preparation, ensuring each installation had proper infrastructure, track marks, fuel dumps, and supporting equipment that made the deception complete. Bill Robson supervised the tank production line. He had streamlined the process through repetition and innovation. Templates ensured consistent dimensions. Pre-cut lumber reduced assembly time. Standard paint schemes eliminated decision-making delays. What once took a full day now required 6 hours. The team could produce 20 tanks per day across all 3 shifts. But speed created new problems. Quality suffered when workers rushed. A poorly constructed dummy might collapse in moderate wind. Incorrect proportions might alert careful analysts. Sloppy painting could reveal the deception. Maskline walked the production floor constantly, checking work, correcting errors, maintaining standards. His theater background had taught him that audiences noticed details even when they didn't consciously recognize them. A prop that looked wrong created subconscious doubt. The same principle applied to military deception. He stopped at a nearly completed Sherman tank. The frame looked solid. The canvas was taut and properly secured, but the paint job was wrong. The weathering patterns didn't match actual tank wear. The mud splatter looked artificial, too uniform, too obviously applied with a brush. A German analyst might not consciously identify the problem, but the image would register as slightly off. Maskline called over the painter, a young man named Thomas Griffiths who had decorated theater sets in Cardiff. Griffiths approached nervously, sensing criticism. "This weathering is too perfect," Maskline explained. "Real tanks get dirty randomly. Mud kicks up from treads in unpredictable patterns. Rain washes some areas clean, while leaving others caked. You're painting what mud should look like, not what it actually looks like. Griffith studied the tank, seeing the problem now. How do I fix it? Maskline grabbed a bucket of thin paint and a large brush. He splattered paint across the tank's side in random arcs, letting it drip naturally, adding concentrated areas near the bottom, lighter spray higher up. Then he took a wet rag and wiped sections away, creating the effect of rain washing through dried mud. The result was chaotic, ugly, and completely authentic. Stop thinking like an artist, Maskline said. Think like weather and physics. Let nature do the work. Griffiths nodded, understanding. He moved to the next tank with new perspective, abandoning his careful technique for controlled chaos. The results immediately improved. Maskline continued his inspection, moving to the aircraft production line. These dummies were more complex than tanks. Aircraft had larger surface areas, more intricate shapes, and needed to be positioned properly on fake airfields. His team had developed inflatable versions for some models, using rubberized fabric that could be inflated with pumps. These were lighter and easier to transport than wooden frames, but they required careful handling to prevent punctures. A completed Spitfire dummy sat near the loading dock. It was entirely plywood and canvas, painted in standard RAF camouflage patterns. The propeller was fixed, not functional. The cockpit was just painted detail, but from above, it looked like a ready fighter aircraft. Maskline had his team position dozens of these on airfields across southern England, creating the impression of massive air superiority concentrated for a Pas-de-Calais invasion. The deception extended beyond physical dummies. Radio operators broadcast fake transmissions, suggesting unit movements and operations. Double agents fed carefully crafted lies to German intelligence. Actual military units made obvious movements that supported the deception narrative. Everything coordinated toward a single goal, convincing Hitler that Normandy was a feint and Pas-de-Calais was a real target. Maskline received regular intelligence briefings showing German responses. They were repositioning forces exactly as predicted. The 15th Army remained concentrated near Calais. Panzer divisions stayed in reserve, waiting for the invasion that matched Allied deception. Even after D-Day began, Hitler would keep divisions near Calais for weeks, convinced the Normandy landings were a diversion. That conviction would cost Germany the war. But Maskline couldn't think about grand strategy. His focus remained on immediate production demands. 3 new installations needed completion before the weekend. His teams were exhausted, working double shifts, surviving on tea and cigarettes and the grim satisfaction of meaningful work. Some had been building dummies for months without break. The repetition was mentally numbing, but they understood the stakes. Every dummy they built was a real soldier who might survive the invasion. Captain Waverly arrived with updated deployment schedules. The 3 new sites were mapped across Sussex, positioned to suggest a massive military buildup aimed at Calais. Each site needed 40 tanks, 20 artillery pieces, support vehicles, and infrastructure. The work would consume their entire output for the next 5 days. Command is pleased with the results, Waverly reported. German reconnaissance flights are increasing. They're clearly taking the installation seriously. Maskline felt no satisfaction. Success and deception was measured by enemy mistakes, not visible achievement. If the Germans believed the dummies, they revealed nothing. If they didn't, disaster followed. He wouldn't know if his work succeeded until after the invasion, when casualty reports revealed whether German forces were properly misdirected. He returned to the workshop floor, watching his team build their Phantom Army. These carpenters and artists had become soldiers without firing shots. Their weapons were saws and hammers and paintbrushes. Their ammunition was lumber and canvas and creativity. They fought a war of perception where victory meant the enemy never realized they'd been fooled. Bill Robson approached, carrying a telegram. New orders from command. They want us to double production. The invasion timeline has moved up. Maskline felt the weight of those words. Earlier invasion meant less preparation time, more pressure, higher stakes. It also meant the deception was working well enough that command felt confident accelerating plans. His wooden tanks had convinced German intelligence. Now real soldiers would benefit from that conviction. Get the crews together, Maskelyne said. We're going to 24-hour operations. No breaks except shift changes. Every available person on production. We build until the invasion launches. Robson didn't question the demand. He simply nodded and moved to organize the teams. Within hours, the workshop transformed into a non-stop operation. Night crews took over from day shifts. Lights burned constantly. The sound of construction never stopped. Maskelyne's Magic Gang was building the largest theatrical production in history, and opening night was coming whether they were ready or not. The night before D-Day, Maskelyne stood in an empty field in Hampshire, surrounded by his Phantom Army. 200 wooden tanks spread across the landscape in carefully orchestrated chaos. Dummy artillery pieces pointed toward the channel. Canvas trucks clustered near supply depots that contained nothing but painted boxes. Overhead, a half moon provided enough light to see the installation without revealing its true nature. This was the largest deception site Maskelyne had created. It represented months of work, thousands of man-hours, and the combined efforts of his entire team. From the air, it appeared as a full armored division preparing for imminent invasion. German reconnaissance had photographed it repeatedly over the past 3 weeks. Intelligence reports confirmed that Hitler's staff believed this force would lead the assault on Pas-de-Calais. Bill Robson walked up beside him, lighting a cigarette. The flame briefly illuminated his weathered face before darkness returned. They stood in silence, two theater men who had become architects of military deception, watching their greatest performance achieve its purpose without audience applause. How many lives do you think we saved? Robson asked quietly. Maskelyne considered the question. Mathematics could provide estimates. Every German division kept near Calais was thousands of soldiers not defending Normandy beaches. Every tank waiting for a phantom invasion was one less tank firing on real landing craft. Every artillery piece aimed at empty fields was one less gun killing Allied troops. But the actual numbers were unknowable, hidden in alternate histories that would never exist. Enough? Maskelyne finally answered. Enough to matter. They had received word earlier that evening. The invasion was launching at dawn. Thousands of ships were crossing the channel toward Normandy beaches. Paratroopers were already dropping behind German lines. The largest amphibious assault in history was underway, and its success depended partly on whether German commanders believed the deception Maskelyne had spent months creating. The wooden tanks around them would remain in position for weeks after D-Day. Even as Allied soldiers fought and died on Normandy beaches, Hitler would keep divisions near Calais, convinced a real invasion was still coming. The Dummies would continue their silent performance, holding German attention while real forces pushed inland. Only after the Normandy breakthrough became undeniable would Hitler realize he'd been fooled. Maskelyne walked among his creations one final time. Each dummy represented a small victory in perception warfare. These weren't weapons that killed enemies. They were weapons that made enemies kill themselves through poor decisions. They exploited the gap between appearance and reality, between what observers saw and what actually existed. That gap was where deception lived, where magicians had always operated, where Maskelyne had learned his craft. He thought about his grandfather performing for Victorian audiences, making objects vanish and reappear, sawing women in half, pulling rabbits from hats. Those illusions entertained crowds who wanted to believe in magic. Maskelyne's illusion served a darker purpose, convincing enemies to believe in armies that didn't exist. But the fundamental principle remained identical. Control what the audience sees. Manage their attention. Give them evidence that supports a conclusion you want them to reach. Make them convince themselves. A military jeep approached across the field, headlights cutting through darkness. Captain Waverly emerged, carrying a leather briefcase. He walked to where Maskelyne and Robson stood, his expression revealing nothing in the dim light. The invasion has begun, Waverly announced formally. Initial reports indicate surprise was achieved. German coastal defenses were undermanned. Reserve forces are not responding as quickly as expected. Maskelyne felt relief wash through him. Surprise meant the deception had worked. Undermanned defenses meant German divisions were positioned elsewhere, probably near Calais, waiting for the army of wooden tanks surrounding them now. His Phantom Force had done its job. Command wants you to know that your work was essential to operational success. Waverly continued. The deception operations exceeded all expectations. German intelligence fell completely for the false narrative. Robson laughed quietly. They fell for Carpenters and canvas. Hitler got beaten by a theater crew. But Mask Line didn't share the celebration. Men were dying on Normandy beaches at this moment. Real soldiers were facing real bullets, fighting through real obstacles, bleeding real blood. His deception had helped them reduce German resistance, improve their odds, but it hadn't made the invasion safe. Nothing could make war safe. What happens to the installations? Mask Line asked. They remain operational indefinitely, Waverly explained. We'll continue maintaining them, even adding to them, keeping German attention fixed on Calais as long as possible. Your teams will keep working. So the performance continued. The wooden army would stand in these fields, drawing reconnaissance flights, occupying German analysts, holding divisions in place, while real soldiers pushed deeper into France. Mask Line's greatest illusion wouldn't end with a final curtain. It would fade slowly as reality overtook deception, as German commanders finally accepted they'd been watching shadows. Over the following weeks, Mask Line received reports from Normandy. The invasion succeeded. Allied forces established beachheads and pushed inland. German resistance was fierce but disorganized. Reserve divisions arrived slowly, delayed by confusion and misdirection. Hitler kept major forces near Calais until mid-July, 6 weeks after D-Day, still believing the Normandy invasion was a diversion. By the time he redirected those forces, the Allies had broken through German defensive lines. The wooden tanks remained in their fields throughout the summer. Weather damaged some, wind toppled others, but enough stayed standing to maintain the illusion. German reconnaissance continued photographing them, and German intelligence continued reporting their presence. The deception outlasted its usefulness, becoming a monument to successful misdirection. Mask Line eventually returned to London as the war moved towards conclusion. His magic gang dispersed, returning to peacetime occupations. The carpenters went back to construction. The artists returned to studios. The theater workers rebuilt careers destroyed by war. They had created the largest deception operation in military history, and most would never receive public recognition. Their work remained classified for decades, hidden in archives, forgotten by historians focusing on conventional battles. But Mask Line knew what they had accomplished. They had proven that perception could be weaponized as effectively as explosives. They had shown that creativity had military value beyond entertainment. They had saved lives by making enemies see things that weren't there, believe things that weren't true, and act on convictions built on illusions. Years later, when military historians finally examined Operation Fortitude, they would calculate that the deception operations shortened the war by months and saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. The wooden tanks, the canvas aircraft, the dummy installations had performed better than anyone imagined. They had convinced Hitler himself, the ultimate audience for this deadly theater. Mask Line never returned to stage magic after the war. The illusion seemed trivial compared to what he had accomplished with wood and canvas in English fields. He had made armies appear from nothing, convinced observers they were seeing reality when they were seeing carefully constructed lies, and changed the course of history without firing a single shot. The Carpenter's wooden dummies had won a battle through optical illusion. They had proven that in modern warfare, what the enemy believes can matter more than what actually exists. And they had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or bomb, but simply making someone look the wrong direction at the critical moment. If you enjoy discovering how wooden dummies changed the course of World War II, there are countless other untold stories from history waiting to be explored. Subscribe to stay with us as we uncover more incredible moments where creativity, courage, and clever thinking shaped our world in unexpected ways.